Everyone is lying to you. My name's Zach the Designer, and I'm a rhetoric and media communications student. I'm interested in many things, and one of those things is environmentalism and sustainability. I just found out that something foundational in the language that everybody uses to talk about the environment is a lie that we've accepted, and I'm here to tell you why and what we can do about it. But before I get ahead of myself, let's start off with an easy question. When discussing the environment, what does the word nature mean? If you can, write it down or type it out now. If not, commit that definition to memory. We're going to be revisiting it a couple times throughout this essay. There's a million correct answers here, but for the purposes of this video, we'll aggregate a couple of definitions online. I encourage you to still write down your own definition though. Bonus points if you're able to see where I'm going and you get there before I do.
The phenomena of the physical world collectively, including plants, animals, the landscape, and other features and products of the earth, as opposed to humans or human creations. The physical world and everything in it, such as plants, animals, mountains, oceans, stars, etc., that is not made by people. All the animals, plants, rocks, etc. in the world, and all the features, forces, and processes that happen or exist independently of people, such as the weather, the sea, mountains, the production of young animals or plants, and growth.
For the purposes of this video, we'll say that nature means the external physical world, including life and non-living material, aside from humans and human interference. If you disagree with this definition, please let me know down below and feel free to substitute your own. Now, a harder question that you don't need to write down the answer to. Is the preservation of nature an effective mission for environmentalism? If so, what does that mission look like? And if not, what mission would be more effective in its place? Keep that question in mind while listening and see if you can't answer it for yourself. Now, there is a lot of history and information surrounding the environmentalist movement in the modern world, and I by no means claim to be an expert on every facet of it. In this video, I'll be focusing on environmentalism in the United States from the 18th century to the present. Even within that scope, this video is not a comprehensive breakdown of the history of environmentalism, but rather an analysis that samples some historical work in order to critique in mainstream environmentalist theory. Additionally, many of these ideas are not my own, and I will do my best to credit them properly in the lower third like so, and in the description. I believe that much of this video's conclusions apply to conservation and sustainability more generally. But if I'm wrong and missing the mark about any of this stuff, feel free to let me know down in the comments and we can construct some meaning together. And, of course, if you like this type of work, let me know through liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing. I don't have a big following right now, it's pretty much zero, so it really does help guide the kind of work I make in the future. With that in mind, let's start off with a review of how we've defined our relationship with nature historically. These days, wilderness is seen as a place for recreation and admiration of the beauty of the natural world. Before the 1800s, Americans, and Western culture more generally, did not have the same relationship with the natural world that we do today. Nature wasn't a place to explore and sightsee, it was a place to be feared. Early associations with the word wilderness included wasteland and barren. Wilderness was viewed as a place with no value and utility for humankind, and one where you were very likely to lose your life. That began to change with the rise of new societal movements and theories around the turn of the 19th century. One of these movements was a renewed interest in pastoral idealism. The pastoral ideal originated as a genre of literature that idealizes rural life and landscapes, and it's old. By far the oldest in this list. The first examples of the pastoral genre are from a Greek poet named Theocritus from around 300 BC and the Roman poet Virgil, who revived the genre in around 38 BC. The pastoral genre has no doubt survived partly because of its romantic origins, but more interesting is what it does. The pastoral idealizes the purifying nature of rural life, which presupposes that urban life and centralized society have a corrupting influence. Another defining feature of the pastoral is that the relationship between man and nature is one of subjugation. Pastoral idealism views nature as having the power to purify the soul, but demonizes its inhumanity, following the historical precedent for wilderness. As a result, the pastoral celebrates nature only when controlled and cultivated by humankind. The revival and interest in this particular type of pastoral idealism began with authors like Emerson, Thoreau, and Hawthorne. The pastoral themes have been baked into American society ever since the colonial era. But the renewed interest in the pastoral ideal wasn't the only influence on early environmentalism. Edmund Burke was a politician and philosopher in Great Britain during the 18th century. His contribution to the field? A treatise called A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. Brother desperately needed an editor for that title. Sublime and Beautiful works to separate the sublime experience from the study of beauty within the philosophical field of aesthetics. According to Burke, the sublime is far from the pleasant experience of beauty, instead being found at the precipice between awe and terror. Burke outlines many elements that coalesce to form the sublime, but the ones relevant to us are obscurity, power, deprivation, and vastness. Obscurity refers to the unpredictability and lack of knowledge that throws one off balance mentally, and power is the dominance in strength and size that overshadows one physically. Deprivation refers to a lack of basic survival resources like food, water, and shelter, and is essential to the disconnection from organized society required to experience the sublime. For example, if you're visiting Yellowstone and you can walk 20 feet behind you to buy a McMuffin, at any moment, it's pretty easy to understand how that would diminish just a little bit of the scene's impact. Vastness is the spatial expression of obscurity, power, and deprivation combined. Being physically isolated in an environment too complicated and large to understand and memorize and indifferent to one's survival is a perfect storm for capturing the sublime experience. You're probably wondering how this treatise connects to early conservation, but just stick with me for a bit. We got one more movement to cover, and then Burke's relevance should start to become apparent. The pastoral and Burke's sublime formed the foundations of the American conservation movement, but the catalyst was the end of the frontier era. The frontier era and American expansionism in general were pervasive throughout American culture until the late 19th century. The Encyclopedia Britannica's page on Manifest Destiny describes this cultural phenomenon. The impatient English who colonized North America in the 1600s and 1700s immediately gazed westward and instantly considered ways to venture into the wilderness and tame it. The cause of that ceaseless wanderlust varied from region to region, but the behavior became a tradition within one generation. The western horizon would always beckon, and Americans would always follow. However, with the incorporation of the last areas of the western frontier into centralized states, the expansionist attitude of Manifest Destiny came to a pause. The founding myth of the United States had been fulfilled, but instead of the attitude being celebratory, the cultural feeling was despair. The frontier era brought an end to the original vision of Manifest Destiny and created a cultural crisis. What was American identity without the wilderness myth? The answer formed through the advocacy of people like John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, and Theodore Roosevelt, and the cultural influence of Ansel Adams, Henry David Thoreau, and Rachel Carson. The successes of their work were rapid and demonstrated the explosion of interest in preserving these spaces. Starting in 1872 and continuing up until the modern day, there are now 63 protected national parks in the United States of America. No longer was wilderness the barren waste of centuries past. In this new era of conservation, wilderness was space to be celebrated for its inhumanity. A national reserve of that vast wealth for generations to come that we have up until now taken advantage of with reckless abandon.
This is a trail in South Dartmouth, Massachusetts called Frank Nowell's Little River Reserve. It's organized by the Dartmouth Natural Resources Trust. It's an inspiring example of a community coming together to preserve the environment. And it's also an example of some pretty interesting biomes that are becoming increasingly rarer due to human activity. Now, the conservation era was a little bit optimistic. With the hindsight of the 2020s, it's pretty clear that designating a few national parks wouldn't be enough as a long-term solution. Earlier, I defined the mission of environmentalism as the preservation of nature. The explosion in popularity of conservationism on the national stage demonstrates that these ideas had sway, but reflecting back on the accomplishments of this movement tells us that the original conservationists had a very particular idea of what nature should be conserved.
For one, the influence of Burke's Sublime on conservation seems monumental. All of the original national parks, Yellowstone, Sequoia, Yosemite, Crater Lake, have a set of common traits. Geographically isolated, vast in size, and alien in landscape to most other biomes and environments that people inhabit. Don't get me wrong when I say that I'm overjoyed that we've preserved these pristine places. But it takes 16 national parks to get to the first park without every characteristic of the Sublime, Hot Springs National Park, and another 4 to get to the next one, the Everglades. It's clear that this draw might be causing us to focus our attention more on a specific aesthetic quality in the natural world rather than on what's truly natural. Additionally, the late Leo Marx, a prominent literary critic and MIT professor, questions the usefulness of the American pastoral ideal in his work of criticism, The Machine in the Garden. This is a different Marx than the big one, by the way. For instance, Marx notes that it is industrialization, represented by images of machine technology, that provides the counterforce in the American archetype of pastoral design. According to this, it's the industrialized, mechanized, digitized society we live in today and the vague anxieties we hold about it that cause us to believe so powerfully in the restorative powers of the natural world. This is reflected in the fact that the original pioneers of the conservation era weren't the communities that surrounded these newly minted nature preserves. They were wealthy urbanites buying up rural property. An entire economy emerged around carving trails, managing hunting grounds, and hiring wilderness guides for what was essentially functioned as a frontier playground for the rich. All of this came from the American pastoral. By understanding modern society as corruptive and the natural world as restorative, the pastoral ideal transforms from a vague utopian dream into a cultural shift where the people who have been benefited most from urbanized society flee from it and impose a privatized, anthropocentric vision against the natural world. Marx's work demonstrates that the cultural counterpressure of the Industrial Revolution enforces a very particular definition of what nature means. Lastly, if you're quick, you might have noticed already that national parks and wilderness reserves are often described like snapshots of the natural world outside of human intervention. What's not often brought into environmentalist discourse are the policies of Indian removal the United States instated to forcibly displace the indigenous populations that surrounded these preserves. This lie is part of what's called the noble savage myth, or the idea that indigenous people are somehow more spiritually connected to the natural world in a way that makes them comparable to wild animals. This is bad, racist for one, but it's also dehumanizing. We don't want to perpetuate this myth in environmentalist culture. The way that we define the preservation of nature shouldn't entail the diminishment or dehumanization of any group of people as part of its mission statement. At this point, it's clear that the preservation of nature as a goal for environmentalism has some flaws. But I don't think we're quite at the point where it's lost its usefulness yet. After all, this goal resulted in some of the first substantial conservation efforts and an increasingly influential environmentalist movement. Let's see how well this movement holds up into the 20th and 21st centuries. The signs of conflict within the American environmentalist movement brewed early. One factor that I didn't mention in the last section is that not all of those artists, authors, and politicians that I mentioned earlier fell into the same camps. There were 2 camps, in fact, the conservationists and the preservationists. The conservationists, people like Gifford Pinchot, Teddy Roosevelt, and Aldo Leopold, advocated for the careful management of natural landscapes to sustainably extract resources for industry and space for recreation. Meanwhile, the preservationists, people like John Moyer, Henry David Thoreau, and Ansel Adams, advocated for the complete protection of natural landscapes from human intervention. Even in its inception, the environmentalist movement was split from within in a way that will make a lot of environmental discourse to the present make a lot more sense. Is environmentalism about preserving nature for human use, or is it about preserving nature in its own right? Should the natural world be something for sightseeing and touristry, or a place for flora and fauna to exist alone? These questions got harder with the dawn of the Anthropocene. Anthropocene is a term referring to the era where human dominance over the world has impacted its geological development, and is thought to have begun about sometime in the 1950s. This is significant because it's the beginning of global climate crises, as well as the point where a unified environmentalist front collapses. The Wise Use movement is a coalition that began in the 1980s that advocates for deregulation of laws protecting the environment, under the philosophy that the free market and local communities are best equipped to make decisions about the environments they inhabit. As the first major result of the split between conservationism and preservationism, the Wise Use movement grew out of conservationist philosophy and unites a wide coalition of members, from outdoor and off-road enthusiasts to disenfranchised workers in lumber and mineral extraction to direct corporate sponsors. The solutions proposed by the Wise Use movement do not make for good environmentalism. The goals of the movement, as stated in Ron Arnold and Alan Gottlieb's Wise Use Agenda, include policies such as removing restrictions on resource extraction within federal lands for the logging, mining, and oil industries, and reducing protections for endangered species that are determined to be in decline before human intervention. There's something more going on here than just thinly veiled propaganda for big oil, though. In the preface for the Wise Use Agenda, Gottlieb writes, "As we cast about seeking to place blame for misusing the earth, our first impulse is to stop using the earth, but we cannot stop using the earth. It is as suicidal to strangle our economy in a fit of guilt and alarm as it would be to willfully continue misusing the earth." This is something that the conservation era failed to address. When environmentalism was about the protection of specific environments for future generations, it was always assumed that anything not directly designated as a national park was available for extraction and development. With the creation of the EPA and decades of victories on the federal level, environmental legislation began to impose national restrictions to intervene in habitat destruction, pollution, and resource degradation. If the goal of environmentalism is to preserve the natural world, and nature is everything separate from humanity, who gets to decide what parts of nature get protected? What are they protected from, and to what degree? At the end of the day, people need certain resources like food, water, and shelter to survive. These resources are going to come from the natural world, and there does need to be some degree of resource conservation to account for that. The Wise Use movement refuses to accept the defeatist notion that man will inevitably destroy his own home. It strives to discover workable methods to achieve sustainable development, enough food, clothing, and shelter and jobs for all mankind to live in humane conditions while enhancing the natural environment through thoughtful and knowledgeable design. According to its authors, the Wise Use movement embraces the goals of environmentalism, such as sustainable development, social prosperity, and environmental enhancement. And yet, does something feel off about this? A big part of the philosophy behind the Wise Use movement is local autonomy. Arnold and Gottlieb argue that most of the legislation protecting the environment is coming from urban areas and are unfairly restricting the people who deal with nature the closest every day. This is in some ways true, as we saw with Marx earlier, but complete deregulation causes the gradual erosion of nature wherever it borders society. Arnold also uses a lot of positive environmental language when describing Wise Use, despite the fact that its goals don't really align with that vision. If environmentalism can be performed as a rhetorical device without bearing any real intent to deliver on it, then we can't simply trust that everyone is telling the truth when making decisions about the environment. And yet, there are more voices in the room than ever. We're into the era of leaded gasoline and ozone holes now, and environmental issues are only going to get bigger in scale from here on out. one thing, climate and sustainability models have become a lot more detailed, and climate scientists are now keeping track of how environmental crises affect each other. The donut model, for example, is a tool developed by economist Kate Raworth that some environmentalists use to visualize the trade-off between the social goals of a prosperous society and the ecological limits of a sustainable society. I like this one. It's fun, and we're going to need some sustainability theory in here anyways. 9 ecological categories make up its outer ring, the ecological ceiling, and 12 social categories make up the inner ring, the social foundation. The space between the outer and inner rings represents an area where humanity has accomplished all of its social goals without exceeding the Earth's carrying capacity in any of the ecological dimensions. Some of the ecological categories will be familiar, like climate change, air pollution, and ozone layer depletion. Most of them, though, are not widely known outside of environmentalism and sustainability circles. I will be oversimplifying them, so I apologize to all climate scientists in attendance in advance, but here is a general breakdown. By the way, it's daytime now. Climate change is one of the big ones. A warming atmosphere means all kinds of problems, such as shifting weather patterns, melting permafrost, sea level rise, and an increase in extreme weather events. It's caused by carbon dioxide, but also by other greenhouse gases like methane and some refrigerants. In a nutshell, the sun emits an amount of heat and light that travels through space and reaches Earth. We call this energy the radiative forcing of the sun. The solar radiation will then either be absorbed by the Earth's surface or reflect off the clouds, ice, and ocean and enter back into space. The heat and light that is absorbed by the Earth is then sent back out as infrared radiation, which has less energy compared to solar radiation. Some of that infrared radiation is blocked from leaving the atmosphere by greenhouse gases, and some of it makes it out. Normally, this system is self-balancing. If the sun emits extra light and the Earth absorbs more energy than usual, then it emits more infrared radiation to compensate, and more energy ultimately makes it out. But when we introduce more greenhouse gases through pollution, we block more infrared radiation from escaping our atmosphere and increase the temperature of our planet. Ocean acidification is closely related to climate change and is a bit more complex. Carbon dioxide causes more than one problem in the atmosphere. When it comes into contact with the ocean, carbon dioxide dissolves into the water to become carbonic acid. Fun fact, it uses the same effect to carbonate sodas and seltzer waters. 25% of the carbon dioxide emitted into our atmosphere gets dissolved into the ocean, which is why it's sometimes referred to as the Earth's largest carbon sink. Once in the ocean, however, carbonic acid slightly increases the acidity of the water. The sensitive ecosystems in the ocean, especially coral reefs and several keystone species, are slowly being eroded by this acidity. The consequence would be ocean-wide ecosystem collapse, which would be a critical tipping point in Earth's ecology, as well as devastating global fisheries and other marine-dependent economies. Chemical pollution refers to the presence of synthetic and damaging chemicals within the environment. This can be plastics, heavy metals, nuclear waste, and organic chemicals with adverse health effects. These molecules tend to be stable in the environment for extended periods ranging from decades to centuries, and could have severe consequences as they become more pervasive. Nitrogen and phosphorus loading is a consequence of our inefficient overuse of fertilizer in the agricultural industry. Nitrogen and phosphorus are common fertilizers that are used to boost crop growth and output. Plants, however, only use a small amount of this fertilizer throughout their lifespans. When rain and water runoff flow through farmland soil to major bodies of water, they collect nitrogen and phosphorus and deposit it into lakes and oceans. This increased load of nitrogen and phosphorus can cause surface algae to bloom or grow excessively. While the algae produce more oxygen in the atmosphere in the short term, they starve the body's water of light and oxygen in the process. This can lead to massive ocean life die-offs and the shutdown of fisheries and water utilities until the bloom ends. Freshwater withdrawal is relatively self-explanatory. People need water and drill wells, dam rivers, and create reservoirs in order to get it. When people draw up too much fresh water, however, there's no longer enough for the local ecosystem to sustain itself. Drought and ecosystem collapse follow, which can even cause desertification. Land conversion refers to excessive human development. When we cut down trees and build roads for housing, commerce, and industry, we damage or destroy the ecology of the local area. This includes local ecosystems and habitats, carbon sinks, and larger natural cycles which may be hard to pinpoint until after they're affected. Biodiversity loss is one of the most important ecological categories, as well as one of the hardest to quantify. Biodiversity is an important metric for the health of any given species and environment, and refers to the amount of genetic diversity in any given population. Basically, natural selection works through selective pressures, or environmental conditions that favor a certain set of traits. We'll start with two birds. If a new selective pressure is affecting the environment, let's say, for no particular reason, warming environmental temperatures, then creatures that are better adapted to that environment will survive more. The bird with less plumage, for example, will have an advantage and be more likely to survive. With less genetic diversity, we might only have birds with thick coats. We wouldn't have any birds who are well adapted to this new environment, and therefore would risk extinction. This applies interspecially as well. Maybe this particular group of birds can adapt due to a loss of genetic diversity, but another one can't. This is biodiversity, and loss of that means that every day we're gambling with higher and higher stakes that the local ecosystems won't collapse. Air pollution is the airborne counterpart of chemical pollution. These are the pollutants and aerosols that gift us with such lovely things as acid rain and smog. Those pollutants stay in the atmosphere for extended periods of time and can cause severe health crises for all living things. Lastly, we have ozone layer depletion. The ozone layer acts as a buffer for the Earth, absorbing high energy radiation before it reaches Earth's surface. Without the ozone layer, this harmful radiation can lyse DNA and other cellular structures and result in the development of several types of cancer. Specific compounds, especially chlorofluorocarbons, also known as CFCs, bind to ozone in this layer of the atmosphere and shred the radiative buffer. Got all that? Good. This is what we're dealing with today. We're currently well behind Earth's regenerative capacity in regards to climate change, nitrogen and phosphorus loading, biodiversity loss, and land conversion. While ocean acidification and freshwater withdrawal haven't outpaced Earth's capacity yet, local areas are still being damaged by both. The World Economic Forum lists air and chemical pollution as currently unquantified. The recovery of the ozone layer since the Montreal Protocol in 1987 banned ozone-depleting chemicals gives us confidence that we can address these issues and transition towards a sustainable future, but the work left to be done is intimidating. As the knowledge, ambition, and influence of the environmentalist movement has grown, the number of issues it faces have clearly grown faster. With the loss of a single unified goal, it's become harder to communicate what environmentalism is about. Environmentalist groups are still divided on whether the goal is to conserve or preserve, and even more divided on what to work towards. What's worse is that anti-environmentalist groups are co-opting the language of environmentalism in order to poison public discourse and foster division. How do we fix this?
This is Gooseberry Neck, an island near Horseneck Beach on the south coast of Massachusetts. It's an island that used to be inhabited, and has 2 abandoned observation towers from World War II still standing. It's open to the public and has a series of paths and a boat launch. Is the environment of Gooseberry Neck natural? Some might say no, because of the regular human presence on the island and the objects and structures that have been left behind. Others might say yes, because of the amount of time that has passed since people lived there, and the environment's biodiversity. The island itself is very biodiverse, but less than a century ago, it was a military base, and then a neighborhood. The signs of those communities are still there, but the plants and animals are indifferent to them. If it isn't natural, should we treat the island any differently? I wouldn't think so. The wildlife is restoring the island's habitat, and regardless of how natural that habitat is, I think that habitat restoration should be a win for environmentalism. And yet, I think a lot of people would be hesitant to describe Gooseberry Neck as having any wilderness or being a particularly good example of nature.
Today, I want to talk about environmental historian William Cronin in his essay, The Trouble with Wilderness. But first, I want to talk about nature. You know how I mentioned that the environmentalist movement was split from within since the beginning? It's not the only one. Nature itself is split from within too. There's physical nature, as in the literal, definitional, categorical sense, but there's also cultural or social nature. This is the nature we mean when we describe something as natural, like a skincare routine or an organic carrot. Basically, it's a collection of everything that the physical definition of nature is used in discourse to justify culturally. These two natures are not the same thing, but we don't think that they're different. This is more than just a semantic problem. Cultural nature is how environmentalism got its start. The resurgence of pastoral idealism, the influence of Edmund Burke's Sublime, and the end of the frontier era were all cultural movements that influenced what we defined as natural and how we felt about that natural world. Countless other movements have created new interpretations of what nature is and have layered more meaning on top of that. But if we remember how we define physical nature, the external physical world, including life and non-living material, aside from humans and human interference, then we could just as easily define that mission of environmentalism as the preservation of everything in the physical world outside of humanity. This line of thinking opens itself up to a lot of problems. First of all, where's the line? Does nature with a capital N start hundreds of miles from the nearest person, or is it in our backyards? Surely we should be able to pinpoint some border between the wild and the domesticated, but how would we be able to do so in any way that wouldn't end up being fundamentally arbitrary? This problem only gets worse. In Trouble with Wilderness, Cronin writes that we seem unlikely to make much progress in solving these problems if we hold up to ourselves as the mirror of nature a wilderness we ourselves cannot inhabit. To do so is merely to take to a logical extreme the paradox that was built into wilderness from the beginning. If nature dies because we enter it, then the only way to save nature is to discontinue living. If nature's a space defined by what it doesn't constitute, humanity, then it becomes hard to figure out what happens to it when nature isn't isolated anymore. Say, if someone were to go on a walk in the wilderness, is the nature there now gone? You could excuse this by saying that the presence alone isn't enough to interfere with the state of nature. But then, what happens when we're dealing with the effects of a global environmental crisis that we've caused? Maybe walking into a forest isn't enough to destroy its natural qualities forever. But are industrial carbon dioxide absorption and rising global temperatures enough? It seems that we either have to conclude that we're destroying nature by existing within it, or that we aren't. If we are, then not only is there no point in pursuing the goals of environmentalism, but nature very well may already have vanished from the world. If we aren't, then is nature synonymous with everything? Removing the human element from our definition of nature, we're left with this: the external physical world, including life, non-living material, humans, and human activity. This doesn't really tell us much about what we're actually supposed to be preserving. Cronin goes further by questioning what we might be missing by preserving nature and wilderness alone. Cronin writes that, for one, a wilderness humanity cannot inhabit makes wilderness the locus for an epic struggle between malign civilization and benign nature, compared with which all other social, political, and moral concerns seem trivial. This would seem to exclude problems of occupational health and safety in industrial settings, problems of toxic waste exposure on unnatural urban and agricultural sites, problems of poor children poisoned by lead exposure in the inner city, problems of famine and poverty and human suffering in the overpopulated places of the earth, problems, in short, of environmental justice. As an ideology and a movement, environmentalism broadly supports the aims of social justice. But the issues that Cronin mentions are not only issues of social justice, they're caused by environmental issues like pollution. Shouldn't what Cronin describes be included in our goals as environmentalists? These might not be environmental concerns that affect nature as we classically define it, but surely we still care about the health and welfare of the environment in which we live. These are environmental problems that environmentalism should address. The preservation of nature doesn't leave us with anywhere to go from here. It just becomes somebody else's problem. Examining the cultural aspect of nature doesn't provide us with any more answers than physical nature does in isolation. Cronin reflects on the cultural outgrowth that has surrounded the idea that nature and wilderness are fundamentally separate from humanity, asking, Why does the protection of wilderness so often seem to pit urban recreationists against rural people who actually earn their living from the land? Why in the debates about pristine natural areas are primitive peoples idealized, even sentimentalized, until the moment they do something unprimitive, modern, and unnatural, and thereby fall from environmental grace? All of these questions imply conflicts among different groups of people, conflicts that are obscured behind the deceptive clarity of human versus non-human. Whether represented through the debate between conservation and preservation, the noble savage myth, the urban environmentalist fighting against rural resistance, or the ease in which opposition can perform an environmentalist aesthetic, it's clear that the division within environmentalism can be traced in part to how natural the distinction between human and non-human can seem. This simple truth blinds us from noticing where the distinction between humanity and the natural world lessens. Some degree of conservation is needed, for example, as we all need resources in order to survive and thrive. Some degree of preservation is needed as well, since those resources are generated by a living, breathing earth. But there's no denying that a balance needs to be maintained between the two, because humanity is part of the natural world, and whatever we take from it for our own purposes will be returned later with interest. If we're not kind to the earth, it won't be kind to us. So, the next logical question is, what kind of environmentalism do we build from this? If the preservation of nature isn't a good mission for environmentalism, we're gonna need a mission to replace it with. Well, if the division in environmentalism is caused by mistaking ourselves as distinct from the natural world, we might make some progress by recontextualizing humanity as an outgrowth of nature. This is already a trend in the field of sustainable architecture. The 15-minute city, for instance, is a model for developing sustainable communities that better serve social needs and emphasize the role of green space in suburban and urban areas. Cities that follow this design model provide all the basic necessities within a 15-minute walk or bike ride. At the heart of these communities is the understanding that human welfare is inherently tied to the design and layout of the environment that people inhabit, and so environmental issues within the community are recognized and resolved. Recontextualizing humanity in this way has other benefits as well. Idealizing a distant wilderness too often means not idealizing the environment in which we actually live, the landscape that, for better or worse, we call home. Even if places like the forests in our own backyards border society, they still function as a habitat and ecosystem of nature that should be valued and protected from desecration. And our own streets deserve the same treatment. People need some amount of green space. People need an environment free of lead in the drinking water and smog in the air. Things like pollution, climate change, and ecological collapse are bad because they hurt all of us, not just because they hurt nature. None of this is to say that nature shouldn't play a role in how we approach environmentalism. Cronin states at several points that my criticism in this essay is not directed at wild nature per se, or even at efforts to set aside large tracts of wild land, but rather at the specific habits of thinking that flow from this complex cultural construction called wilderness. Nature still serves as an important tool to identify what impact we are having on the world around us. The problems start when we begin to confuse this category for our mission, which should ostensibly be to work towards a cleaner, safer, healthier, and more sustainable planet. By eliminating the distinction between humanity and the natural world in our environmental theory, we can build an environmentalism that is more resilient against being co-opted by opposition groups. When contributions to environmentalism aren't measured in allegiance but by accomplishment, environmentalist ethics become more difficult to perform disingenuously. A plural environmentalism that acknowledges humanity as part of nature is just better theory. The national park system is great. Wilderness preservation efforts are awesome. I'm overwhelmingly glad that we have refuges of nature open to the public and preserved elsewhere. And like any good criticism, I'm saying yes, and when we prioritize these spaces over the places we inhabit, we're leaving some really important work behind for somebody else to do. Environmental justice should serve the whole environment, not just the parts of it that we hold in high cultural regard. I get the feeling that a lot of mainstream environmentalists are drawn to the aesthetic of the movement. After all, we interpret something being natural as a good characteristic, at least in our current cultural moment. I get the feeling that a lot of mainstream environmentalists are drawn to the aesthetic of the movement. After all, we interpret something being natural as a good characteristic, at least in our current cultural moment. But I also can't shake the feeling that many strategies that we're fighting for are, I don't know, tending a nice garden while the house burns down. We've decimated these spaces that are pristine, sublime examples of the natural world while erasing the history of the people who used to live there. We're only increasing the scale of our consumption more every year, and that has severe consequences on the environments that we live in. And if nature is defined by what hasn't been affected by us, how do we fix the damage we've done already? We can plant new trees and forests, but the loss of those ecosystems make any restoration efforts we attempt seem artificial in some indescribable way. At the end of his essay, Cronin writes that the tree in the garden is in reality no less other, no less worthy of our wonder and respect than the tree in an ancient forest that has never known an axe or a saw, even though the tree in the forest reflects a more intricate web of ecological relationships. I think that this is important for us to consider in our environmentalism. We as people are part of the environments that surround us. Our actions that we take to restore and mitigate damaged ecosystems matter because nature is part of who we are. And defining nature as fundamentally separate from us denies us that truth when we're trying to do good environmentalism. To me, that's big nature. The idea that we're somehow separate and above from the environment that we inhabit. That our actions have some undetectable, corruptive quality that destroys what we want to protect. So the next time you're communicating about environmentalism, what should you do? Well, to start, environmentalism and sustainability have two sides to them. There's environmental science and sustainable engineering, and then there's environmentalism and sustainability. It's similar to the distinction I made earlier, one's science and one's culture. It's important to make clear in conversation which is informing what you're saying. Environmental science is a great tool for solving problems and gathering knowledge, but it generally isn't a good tool for bringing people together. It's also a topic that most people are not going to be deeply informed about. Environmentalism, as a cultural half, is a great tool to bring people together and organize our efforts. However, the way that we talk about the environment matters. What we prioritize in environmentalism has a direct impact on public perception and the direction where research goes. With that in mind, we should start trying to recontextualize humanity as part of the natural world in our environmental discussions. Instead of taking sides in conservation or preservation, we should try to find a balance between the two, where enough resources are conserved for human welfare and productivity without having a significant impact on the environment that provides those resources. We should attempt to notice when the culture we've been brought up in has blinded us to our biases, like with the romantic sublime and pastoral idealism, and we should start thinking about environmental justice within our communities, whether urban, suburban, or rural. We are all part of the natural world. This is all of our homes. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and let me know what you think down below. I like to write, but I also have far too many interests, so if you like this type of content, please let me know. It helps inform me more than you realize. Down with big nature, and I'll see you next time.